Hello everyone, this is PK Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another entry in the ongoing Unrated Appreciated series, and this edition we will look at one of my most favourite films ever, and that is Deep Cover. This is a dark, gritty, crop thriller gangster drama that was released in April 15th, 1992. It stars Laurence Fishburne, Jeff Goldblum and Charles Martin Smith, and it was directed by Bill Duke. The setup of Deep Cover is that it follows the story of Russell Stevens Jr., who is a police officer for the LAPD, and we get the first original scenes where we see that his father was an alcoholic and he tries to rob a bank and gets murdered in the process, and that's the driving motivation behind Russell wanting to become a police officer, because he doesn't want to end up in the same way that his father did. Over time, he's given a special undercover assignment to infiltrate the narcotics drug organization of the East Coast, of which the head figure is a South American politician of whom the police department has been pursuing for years. He uses the alias John Hull, and he comes across various shady figures and gangsters over his operation. He then makes a major contact with an attorney lawyer, David Jason, who is played by Jeff Goldblum, and he's also a drug dealer. And through building a relationship with David, John quickly rises through the ranks, becoming a major player within the drug dealing business. Things eventually get more complicated the deeper John delves into the criminal underworld, and all of a sudden he finds himself being used and manipulated by both sides of the law. He has to make difficult decisions which could end up costing his life, and all of a sudden the line between a police officer trying to make a difference and becoming a major drug dealer becomes blurred. So what's good about Deep Cover? Why is it for me one of the best ever movies and one of my most favourites? Well, Deep Cover is an extremely stylish and dark and gritty story. Everything from the direction, the editing, the music has a real raw and vivid energy, but at the same time there is depth in terms of reflecting on the urban culture, the influence on drugs and narcotics within society, and this is particularly within the first act, where we really see references to the damage that drugs can have on people within these poor urban areas. I always love films that really have a deeper meaning and a deeper message behind the original story that they're trying to tell. The best and most successful movies for me are always ones that have multi-layers to them. So Deep Cover itself, on the one hand, is a cop thriller, on the other hand is a gangster drama, and also on the other hand is a social commentary. We spend moments throughout the movie referencing to the streets and how these people are really damaged by the use of drugs and narcotics, and how we really should be striving to make this a better place, a better world for people to live in. Deep Cover comes from that really classic early 90s era for me, where we really had a series of visceral, powerful urban dramas and stories that were really full of raw purpose and figure and energy. Films like this include Boys in the Hood in 1991, directed by John Singleton, which also starred Laurence Fishburne. We had a couple of years later The Superior Menace to Society in 1993, very similar to Deep Cover in terms of its real raw and unflinching look at the subject matter of drugs and urban society. We of course have, for me, the truly iconic New Jack City in 1991, starring Wesley Snipes and directed by Mario Van Peebles. We had the vastly underrated The King of New York in 1990, starring Christopher Walken and again Laurence Fishburne in a limited supporting role, and a brilliant movie which I will also include later on in this Unrated Underappreciated series. Deep Cover also works very well as a drama and a cop thriller. We have interesting characters all throughout the story, all of which have their own agendas. There's no clear-cut hero or villain here. There's no good guy or bad guy. Everybody is morally ambiguous or morally compromised, and it's very good throughout the story where we see constant scenarios and situations which forces these characters to really look out for themselves. They have to cope with the certain consequences of their actions, and it's very compelling to watch. It gives the film, I think, a certain unpredictability about it. Despite the fact that some characters are clearly the villain, they all have a certain charisma and a likability about them which makes you attracted to them, even though the fact that maybe they are perhaps the most dangerous characters within the story. The performances of the cast are all of a high caliber. We have Laurence Fishburne in the lead role, and he's very solid and convincing as John. He's got a very determined resolve about him. Despite the fact he delves more and more into the drunk underworld and organisation, there is still a strong determination from him to do the right thing. Even though he questions the methods that he's been using, he ultimately wants to make the world a better place. And Fishburne is a strong, reliable presence, and this was really early on in his career when he had promising roles, as I mentioned before, in both Boys in the Hood and King of New York, and also in Tina, What's Love Got to Do With It back in 1993. I think he produced a very compelling performance as Ike Turner. So this was really, in terms of his career, I think the prime stage. Even though he would later on to star in the likes of the Matrix movies later on, I think this was really the peak in terms of his acting prowess, where he was really involved in some very strong and challenging roles. So it's a very good lead performance from Laurence Fishburne. One standout performance is from Charles Martin Smith, who, if you remember, was as Wallace from the classic film The Untouchables, and he plays John's superior agent Gerard Carver. And this is a very serpentine performance from Gerard. In the beginning, you think he's very harsh talking, but he ultimately wants to do the right thing. But later on in the story, we very much find that he has his own agendas and is very much looking out for himself. I love the dynamic between both him and Fishburne, the conversations that they have together. He's always claiming that he's God and he simply knows everything that goes on, which again makes him a far more interesting and compelling character to watch, because over the course of the story you want to see how exactly does he know everything that goes on, in the same way that Laurence Fishburne's character also does. So it's a very duplicitous and great performance from Charles Martin Smith, and I think he did a very good job. We have Gregory Sciarra as Felix Barbosa, who is one of the drug's underbosses, and he is a very eccentric and charismatic character as well, to an extent. And there's overall a very constant tension between him and David. He's constantly berating David on his ambitions. David has this elaborate scheme to create this new synthetic drug that you don't have to grow and you can get by without any customs, and it's a lot easier to distribute. And Felix is really one who puts David down a lot, and as the story escalates we really see these two come together, and it's just a fascinating dynamic. And again, it's a very distinctive character that is played, and Gregory Sciarra does very well in this role. We have Clarence Williams III as Detective Tuft, and he's a religious, very much of a church Bible character, and he's the one who acts as the conscience for John. He's the one who's trying to advise John of his actions, trying to put him on the right path as he delves further and further into the drug dealing. He's a very vital character, as you find out later on within the story. We have Victoria Dillard, who plays the role of Betty, and she's the kind of love interest within this role, and she plays a character who helps launder David's money that he makes from the business, and she strikes a relationship with John later on. It's not really a particularly large performance from her. She gets a couple of intense scenes, as we learn later on throughout the story, but she does a decent job with the role that she's given. Now for me, despite all of the compelling characters and performances by the various cast, without question the standout performance throughout this movie is from Jeff Goldblum as David. And this is really one of those great examples where we see an actor really acting out of type, out of his comfort zone, if you like. And I think it's always great when we see actors trying to do something different, trying to go against type or form. In many ways it can make them an even better actor. If we look at Jeff Goldblum, we normally relate to him as the kind of scientist, the nerdy doctor, or if we look particularly at his biggest movies that he's been involved in, we're looking at, of course, Independence Day, the Jurassic Park movies, if you look earlier on with The Fly as well. And he's generally been that more kind of comedic performance, especially when we look more recently at the likes of Thor Ragnarok. But this is a performance that is very much against type. As David, he's very calculating, very calm and assured. He's leaving his double life as an attorney, lawyer and a drug dealer as well. But over the course of the series, we see his vulnerability and his constant back and forth with Barbossa. As I mentioned before, Barbossa is constantly talking down to him, and over the course of the story, it's David who loses his composure and he becomes a lot more frantic and a lot more reckless as the story rages on. And I love the chemistry that he has with Laurence Fishburne as we see the relationship between David and John develop over the story. We see moments of testosterone and back and forth between the two, but it's very much, I think, David likes the character of John because John is prepared to go the extra mile that David won't. We see in multiple stories where we see David having to deal with drug dealers. He does the things that David's not prepared to do. So they actually prove to be a great combination. Jeff Goldblum is fantastic. I actually think it's one of his most commanding, most interesting and watchable performances. It might be, dare I say, his best performance on screen, and it's something that never really gets alluded to as with the rest of this movie when you look at Goldblum's career. Very charismatic, very intelligent, and over the course very interesting. There's very a darkness about him because he really wants to live the high life. He could be a successful lawyer, but he wants his cake and eat it too, as he says. He wants to be able to have the attorney, lawyer and the drug dealer business as well. It's a magnificent performance from Jeff Goldblum, and along with Larry Fishburne, it really drives the story forward. What I also love about Deep Cover is the music. It's a very much of that hip-hop fueled soundtrack. Of course, it features that great track of 187 by both Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. You can hear that in the end credits, and I just love the beats and the tones of the music here. It really gives that cinematic flavour, particularly if you look at the earlier sequences where we see John beginning his undercover operations and he's walking through the streets. I love the editing and the music as the beats flow back and forth between John dealing on the streets and then he's giving his information to Gerard, and the way that the editing does is very much of the zooming in and zooming out as the characters, as the beats travel along, and then we see Detective Taft in his car trailing John as he's dealing in drugs, and the back and forth between the beats and the hip-hop soundtrack. It's great. I love all that. It just gives the film a nice energetic flow about it, and the soundtrack I think is very key. Once again, very indicative of the movies that were released at this time. So if I had to give a score for Deep Cover, I would give it a 9.2 out of 10. Like I said, it's a very stylish and dark and gritty thriller, full of energy, full of figure, but with a purpose and a message underlying. Really one of the best standout movies that we got within that early 90s stage of urban dramas about it. Now, when we look at the release of Deep Cover, it unfortunately only managed to gross around 16.6 million at the US box office. And to be honest, I'm not really surprised. Along with a lot of the films that I mentioned previously within this era, none of them were really big box office successes. I think the most successful one at the time was Boys in the Hood, and that was really a much more of a simplified look at this type of culture and a life and this environment. Other movies that preceded really went much more deeper into the characters, into the stories and within these issues, and Deep Cover is one of those movies, much like Menace to Society, where it's a much more raw and uncompromising look. It's very bleak in nature, and it really, as I mentioned before, doesn't want to paint these people in one light or the other. Everybody's morally compromised, and movies of this genre will never be massively successful at the box office. It's not necessarily that they're bad movies or they didn't have the promotion as such. It's just, again, it's very adult orientated and they're not as simplified as what earlier films were. So it's a very complex and challenging themes that it has throughout the movies, and at that time I don't think it was very appealing as such to audiences. So it's quite violent as well, along with bad language as well. So again, that's why I think it really wouldn't have struck gold at the box office, and I really think it is deserving of a lot more recognition. I even think it still holds some relevance now, and if you were to watch it now, I think you would find it's a very stunning and stylish gritty thriller full of compelling performances, a standout performance indeed from Jeff Goldblum, and I really think that Deep Cover is one of the best movies of the early 90s, and it's definitely underrated and underappreciated. So those are my thoughts for now on Deep Cover. If you managed to see the movie, let me know what you think in the comments below of what you think about it. If you've already seen the movie, let me know as well. Do you agree with me? Do you feel that it's very underrated and underappreciated? Do you think it definitely deserves more recognition? Do you feel it's amongst the best performances of both Laurence Fishburne and Jeff Goldblum as well? And do you think that if it was released in today's culture, would it have got more recognition, or do you still feel it's too dark and too stark in nature to ever reach a mainstream audience? But for me, it definitely is deserving of a bigger and larger audience, and definitely deserves more praise than what it got when it was released in cinemas. So those are my thoughts for now on a superb and very compelling film in Deep Cover. Let me know what you think in the comments below. That's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.